None of those wars with Iran have gained any political effect onto the Likud and the coalition itself. One of the problems of Netanyahu is the effect of the October 7th and the fact that he's the same person who was in charge in October 7th.
Look, we had the worst day in Israeli history, the worst day for Jews since the Holocaust in terms of October the 7th. Trying to marginalize or destroy these enemies, they're still there. And therefore, your argument that only you can do it rings more hollow than it did certainly before October the 7th, and still rings hollow because that regime is still in power in Iran.
The Israeli election season has gotten underway. While the vote is not expected until at least September, the parties have started to jockey for position already. Recently, Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister and frontrunner for the upcoming elections, and Yair Lapid, the current leader of the opposition in the Knesset, have announced that they will run together under a new party, Biyachad, or Together. I'm David Makovsky of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and I'm happy to go on this journey with you. Still reeling from the past 2.5 years of war, the elections, the first since October 7th, will be the most consequential for Israel and the region in decades, shaping the Mideast and deciding the very character of Israel for years to come. To understand how the newly formed party faces off against the incumbent Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and how the looming elections could influence policy decisions on Israel's many active fronts right now, I talked to two leading Israeli commentators covering these issues closely. Gili Cohen covers the Prime Minister for Israel TV and Radio's public channel known as Khan, and David Horovitz is the founding editor-in-chief for the Times of Israel. Gili and David, welcome both to Decision Points.
Thanks, David.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
First, I want to understand the Israeli elections are a few months away. The exact date has not yet been set, but we know it's soon. So we really want to understand what will determine whether the outcome of the Iran war is a political plus or a political minus for Prime Minister Netanyahu as he runs for another term in the months ahead. So why don't we start with you, Gili?
I'll first say that in any poll that have been made on the first Iran war on June 2025, and also after the second Iran war, the 40 Days War, none of those wars with Iran have gained any political effect onto the mandates of the Likud and of the coalition itself. I haven't spoken with even one person who told me, yes, I'll vote to this person due to Iranian attack. It doesn't really matter. One of the problems of Netanyahu and the problems of all of us in the Israeli society is the effect of the October 7th. And the fact that Netanyahu was trying to deliver that he is the one who will guide Israel. He is the only person who can say no to the American president, the only leader who can forecast what's going on in the geopolitical arena. But he's the same person who was in charge in October 7th. And he is the same person who, this is debate in Israel, what is his responsibility to the massacre? And I don't think that Iran issue at all matters to the Israeli public. It does affect how people react to Netanyahu and his promises, his defense promises and his policy promises, that most of them didn't become into reality.
Okay, David, over to you. How do you see it?
Netanyahu has tried to distance himself from responsibility for October the 7th. And that's why, if you do look at the polls, they all show that his current coalition is around 50 seats in the Knesset of 120. So nowhere near a majority. And in fact, the dialogue, bizarrely in Israel, in a way, is the opposition still doesn't have a majority. The opposition is 70 seats in the polls, but 10 of those are the Arab parties, and therefore Netanyahu is very skillfully really hyping up the notion that any partnership with any of the Arab parties would be tantamount to, I'm not sure he would say treason, but I'm not sure he wouldn't. And of course, that flies in the face of the fact that Netanyahu himself tried to recruit one of the Arab parties when he was desperately trying to build a coalition, and when his main rival, Naftali Bennett, did precisely that. In terms of the Iran war, it is all one of a part with October the 7th. Netanyahu, in the minds of, I think, probably a majority of Israeli voters, but not an unreversible majority. I think for most Israelis, October the 7th was Netanyahu's failure. He's dodged responsibility. And then you add to that, Hamas is still there in Gaza. It controls the half of Gaza where Gazans live. So Israel controls the other half. But Hamas is rebuilding in Gaza. Hezbollah, which Netanyahu assured Israel had basically been defanged, turns out not to have been defanged. We have ground troops in Lebanon now. And here is Hezbollah, which was supposedly no longer a threat. And then ultimately Iran. So if you want a single issue, and I don't think this would be new to anyone listening in the United States, if the end of this is the regime still in power, and moreover still with a path to the bomb because it retains its 60% enriched uranium stockpile and so on, then I think it will be very hard for Netanyahu to try to persuade Israelis that he's anything approaching Mr. Security. And after a while, maybe more of them will not be persuaded by his argument that everybody who opposes him is essentially not just a leftist, but a dangerous leftist, because people will say, but okay, so you're the safe guy? Look, we had the worst day in Israeli history, the worst day for Jews since the Holocaust in terms of October the 7th. Trying to marginalize or destroy these enemies, they're still there. And therefore, your argument that only you can do it rings more hollow than it did certainly before October the 7th, and still rings hollow because that regime is still in power in Iran.
So on just the Iran point, and you mentioned the nuclear, if this war ends with the nuclear stockpile still in Iran after this is over, is he politically vulnerable in your view?
I'm not sure it's his main vulnerability, but underpinning the politics is how Israelis feel about the well-being of their country and their bottom line safety and security. And that's why it's so central to politics. If this regime is still in power and it still has a path to the bomb, never mind what choice they'll make on election day, although that's very critical, Israelis will think, oh my God, this is terrible. These people who want to kill us are still there and they're still trying to kill us and they still have a path to kill a lot of us very quickly. It's in the context of an incredible personal national security issue that we say, yes, of course, for Netanyahu, this is going to be a problem. Never mind that. For Israel, this is going to be a problem. And we sit here in Israel and we hear President Trump say many, many things, some of them contradictory within the same sentence. But when he says things like, I'm negotiating with people, they're more reasonable, they're less radical, essentially there's been regime change. We know in Israel that's not true. All right? Netanyahu does not try to claim that. Netanyahu knows that he would be ridiculed in Israel for claiming, because we know it's not true. And therefore, again, our sense of genuine threat by really bad people who mass murder their own people and want to kill us all, that's why it's a political issue for sure, but it's an existential issue for Israelis.
I just want to add that it cannot be a regime change whether the leader has the same last name as the oldest. He's the son of Ali Khamenei. It cannot be a regime change.
That hasn't gotten too far in America either, I should say, no matter the fact that the president has repeated it a few times. I want to go theater by theater, but before I do, I just feel that an elephant in the room here, at least, maybe not in Israel, is the U.S.-Israel relations. And Pew polls are very reputable in America. And in my lifetime, I've never seen a 60% disapproval of Israel. And we used to talk a few years ago about the progressives, but we're seeing it also among some young Republicans and young evangelicals, too. It doesn't seem that this issue from afar, that this issue gets the gravity it deserves, maybe because people think as long as Trump is there with Bibi, all is good with the world. But what do you think it would take to get Israelis to talk about this?
I think that this is the problem, that we are watching and not doing anything in order to change it or in order to influence it. It's not also on the agenda of our generation and our connections with our equivalent in the U.S. And there is in Hebrew a sentence saying, Am levado yishkon, that Israel will be no matter...
A nation that dwells alone.
Exactly.
But as Jonathan Sachs says, that's a curse, not a blessing.
Exactly. And you can say that you don't have to take into consideration what others feels about you, but there's option of sanctions toward Israeli universities, of the Israeli academia, of Israel national sports team, of Israel participation in the Eurovision, of finger crossed someday Israel will try to participate in the World Cup. we are part of the world. And in order to be a part of the world, we have to take into consideration also the disadvantage of Israel's acts and Israel's war. And the fact that this war, specifically the Iranian war, is considered as the one that Israel grabbed Trump into it, it's a problem, taking into consideration exactly what David said, that the end point today of this war is with all of the above, with the regime still in charge, with more power to the regime that feels that they can close Hormuz, they can do whatever they want, and they also are still gaining the uranium stockpile. This is the problem. Besides the policy, the narrative that this is due to Israel actions and due to specifically Prime Minister Netanyahu, who convinced Trump to do so.
David, you probably more than anybody, because as the head of the Times of Israel, you watch very closely how Israel is seen. How do you see it from your vantage point?
In the context of Iran, Israel and Trump did not make an effective enough case for American involvement in this war. So therefore, there's the resentment that ostensible Israel dragging Trump into it. And there is a very clear case to be made. This is a terrible regime. It is not only a threat to its own people and a threat to Israel, it fired on Europe. Never mind people it's hostile to in the region. It's been attacking people who've defended it in the region. It's been targeting Qatar. It fired on Turkey, which is lobbying for Hamas. And its foreign minister said, what can we do? We can't hit America yet. He didn't say yet, but we can't hit America. So we have to fire on other places that are nearer. It's mind-blowingly, I don't know, I want to be polite here, but it's very bizarre that Americans do not recognize that the threat is not some inflated Israeli threat. If you're somebody who's concerned about humanity, are you indifferent to the fact that tens of thousands of Iranians were murdered by their own regime? You're very angry with Israel, which was trying to tackle a terror group that's vowing to wipe it out because civilians were killed in Gaza. We all regret civilians being killed in Gaza. And I'm not making any kinds of comparisons, but I'm citing a very different arena. The government killed its own people for daring to oppose them by the tens of thousands. And yet the hostility to Israel is so acute that never mind that the Iranian public is broadly pro-Israel, the exiled Iranian public is obviously pro-Israel, begging America and Israel to come and save them from their homophobic, misogynistic, repressive, terrible regime. Because Israel's in the mix somehow, it can't be a justified war. There can't be any legitimacy, never mind what the Iranian public is saying. That's really staggering to me. And broadly speaking, I think there's a wider bottom line issue here. Israel's been pretty demonized. The fact that Netanyahu's government is really problematic for many Israelis within Israel, that's one truth. It can exist simultaneously with the fact that lots of terrible people in this region are trying to wipe us out and kill all the Jews and attack lots of other people. And yet somehow people can't get their head around that, or they're being misled, strategically misled. We can go back to October 7th, and within days you have people protesting with banners saying "from the river to the sea," and not even knowing what those banners mean. The superficiality and then the malevolence of the manipulators. So it's a pretty dire reality, and you're right to be concerned, and Israel is foolish to not be concerned, and you can't build all your hopes on a president in a country with term limits, unlike ours, right? Trump is not going to serve a third term unless he really batters American democracy. And there are some candidates who might want to preserve a strong relationship with Israel, but there are plenty of others who will not be centrally devoted to trying to rebuild the relationship. So it's a really worrying situation. We need allies. We're not capable of surviving on our own. I'm very sorry. You can't do that in the real world, economically, diplomatically, and probably militarily as well. So I think we should be very concerned, and we should focus on how do we rebuild this and build better relations with the diaspora and not be so deaf to the concerns of the diaspora. And in terms of public advocacy, we could spend hours talking about that, not taken seriously here. It wouldn't change everything, but if you're not even giving, we're a news organization. We try to get real-time Israeli responses to allegations coming out of Gaza, for example, or Iran. It's just impossible. Never mind, I'm not talking about propaganda. I'm not talking about social media influencing. I'm talking about trying to report the facts. Hamas-affiliated something or other says something or other happened in Gaza, and Israel says nothing at all. And that's an abiding reality. It was true 10 years ago and 20 years ago, but it's never been more damaging.
Let me go back to the ground and what's going on there. Both of you mentioned Lebanon. I'm asking you how the Lebanon war plays into the election. Is it all a function of expectations? Could the prime minister have calibrated it differently? Gili?
I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu thought it will be different. If you are monitoring Trump's truth tweets, he was also making the Rose Garden ready for the president of Lebanon, Aoun, and Prime Minister Netanyahu to walk Amgazeh in D.C., and it won't happen. And I think that Netanyahu really count on this because, first of all, he would like a new normalization, Abraham Accords 2.0, in order to have, again, the narrative of the only leader who can deliver. But again, you've mentioned the expectations. I think it's more the reality. The reality on the ground is that this ceasefire, as the last one from the summer of 2024, are not popular in the Israeli society and are not really existing. There is still fire each and every day in Lebanon. And soldiers are getting hit and unfortunately also got killed due to Hezbollah fire. People that live in the northern border of Israel suffering on a daily basis from Hezbollah fire. And nothing really changed. Israel narrative are still mentioning the ceasefire that is ongoing and that Israel is committed to. But it's a complex message that Netanyahu cannot change it into is one of his sharp points saying a total victory or saying that we defeat Hamas, we defeat Hezbollah. We didn't. And I think this is one of the problems, again, that Netanyahu is trying to saying in a sort of complex way, but his audience are not ready to complex messaging. They want it sharp, they want it clear, they wanted to feel that we are winning all of those wars, even if we are not in a total victory point of view.
So, David, same question to you. Do you feel, on one hand, Bibi will say, remember the beepers. Remember who decapitated Nasrallah and the leadership. Hezbollah is not nearly where it was at. Does he win on points, or does it, you say, look, it's the result, and he promised us more, and he may have weakened them, but he didn't eliminate them?
He obviously wants to minimize the damage of the facts. And the facts that as we've said a few times, is there has not been complete victory. If you were his advisor, would you be saying to him, listen, you can admit that it's proving stickier than you thought, but you could say the opposition would never have tried any of this and we've made lots of progress, or you can brazen it out. That's his inclination, is to brazen it out and blame everybody else for the things that haven't worked. He's empathy deprived. He doesn't have those tools. He can't. He gets asked questions by somebody who's just come back from a month or two of Miluim, and he castigates them because they're a journalist, rather than saying, how fantastic that you did your service, right? There's the Netanyahu playbook. I think what's interesting, we've not touched on the always moving polls, but broadly speaking, his support has not collapsed. And you could argue that he's been a disaster. October the 7th is a paramount disaster. And yet he still thinks he's got a realistic chance, and he has got a realistic chance. And you should never write Netanyahu off. He's brazening it out. He's facing a disunited opposition, and reality is a big problem for him. There isn't a ceasefire in the north, as Gili said. There's constant attacks on the north. It's not safe to live in the north. And this is not a country where Israel is, a 32nd the size of Texas? The north is not like some distant airline journey away. It's up the road. Gaza's an hour, 15 minutes from where Gili and I are speaking to you in Jerusalem, right? So that's one thing. I just want to add two other things, one of which is I hope the elections in Israel will be fair. If you can deter Israeli Arabs from voting, it will be quite a success for Netanyahu, and it wouldn't take a lot to make life difficult for them to vote. There are things that could play out. I'm not saying there will. So that's one thing. And I think his vulnerability, or one of his biggest vulnerabilities, is semi-domestic in the inequality regarding the ultra-Orthodox community. That is a colossal internal source of grievance and anger, including from within the bloc of voters who normally would be expected to support a Netanyahu-led bloc, right? When reservists in their 30s and 40s have done, in many cases, essentially a year of reserve duty since October the 7th, there are people on their sixth terms of 60 days in Miluim. And there's the ultra-Orthodox community being funded with their tax payments to not do anything at all in a skewing of Judaism, we should stress. I think that's among his deepest vulnerabilities. The security situation, which we discussed at length, the relationship with the United States, but domestically, the fastest growing sector, maybe 14% right now, of the Israeli population being excused military service in defiance of court rulings, in defiance of responsible Judaism. That's a terrible vulnerability for Netanyahu.
So maybe all these foreign policy security challenges, we always think Israelis vote on security, but with the ultra-Orthodox issue so prominent, with the issues like, is there going to be an October 7th investigation or an inquiry, independent commission of inquiry or not? If there's going to be the judicial relationship to the state is going to change under the whole overhaul question. Some might say, look, this is an election where foreign policy and security maybe sound a little more removed given these domestic challenges. Gili, do you think so?
I think that those elections are truly shaped by one factor. Are you a voter of hope or fear? If you're a voter of hope, you would rather change this government, having the new combination of someone else who is not Benjamin Netanyahu. If you're a voter of fear, you are basically, as David mentioned, there is a truly big base of Netanyahu and the Likud party who are willing to have the same. It also combines the Arab question in Israel. By the way, David, I think that on those elections, Netanyahu, not publicly, but will try to raise the vote of the Arab population, because this how he can shape it towards the deadlock that he is willing to. That he cannot govern coalition, and also Bennett and Eisenkot could not succeed in this. But again, I truly believe that there will be no policy on those elections, only fear. And we can, by the way, notice it even on today's Israeli social media. What the Likud is trying to promote is, again, the fear from the Arabs. And what Bennett and Eisenkot and Yair Golan and all those parties are trying to highlight is that we can have a different government in Israel.
David, could you explain a little bit about the core Netanyahu supporters? In other words, sometimes they're called the Bibistim. Now, the core and the Bibistim might not be the same. And how much of it is a sense of defiance? They once said about Yasser Arafat, he is the stone we throw at the world. And how much of it is a defiance of the Israeli elite?
He's a member of the elite with billionaire support. He's a non-Sabbath observant, treif-eating secular Jew. And yet he's championed by traditional Jews. He's as Ashkenazi as they come, I suspect, and a lot of his support is from people who think that there's an Ashkenazi elite ruling Israel. He's in a different class as a basic politician. He has multiple ways of reaching people incredibly effectively. He's gradually gained control of more and more of the media. Gili Cohen is working for an outlet that is courageously independent and not for the lack of Netanyahu trying, right? I'll say that. I don't know, she can define it for herself. But Channel 14, which was a nothing channel of really hardline pro-Netanyahu, I think it's the second best ranked television channel in Israel now after Channel 12. And its success, and it's slavishly pro-Bibi when it's not far to his right and saying things that would even discomfort him. He's incredibly potent on social media. He's astoundingly articulate. He can be incredibly insensitive and self-defeating at times, but he's still, in terms of most of the professionalism, the adroitness of his language, he's a powerhouse politician. And part of it, I think what you said about the ostensible champion of the underclasses, however bizarre that might sound, the ostensible champion of traditional Jews and Orthodox Jews. If you're in the ultra-Orthodox community, we hear all the time about they're going to leave the coalition over this and that. They're not leaving any Netanyahu coalition because no other coalition would kowtow to them to the extent that he has had to in order to retain power. The Haredi issue is also a security issue because we are less secure as a nation. I'm talking about physically and economically and psychologically because of the strains on our people's army, which is a large part reservist army, because of the treatment of the Haredim. So even things that may not appear to ultimately derive from security have their security application, which for me, I'm not disagreeing at all with Gili's hope as opposed to fear, but I am saying that the election, the security concern or the security hopes fears or hopes around security, it's another way of saying the same thing. I still think people's security ultimately, and we've had elections where it was ostensibly all about economics, and there have been hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating in Tel Aviv about the cost of living. Ultimately, we're in a very small country in a really nasty region. Much of the world hates us in many cases because they don't begin to understand. In some cases, because they're a bunch of anti-Semites. Israelis are primarily concerned with our capacity to live safely here. And that's, however you define it, however it plays out, however it shapes the choices that people make, that is the key to the elections and to Israelis' core mindset.
So let me ask you about Gaza, which has not been front and center given the focus on Iran, the focus on Lebanon. And basically, Hamas still seems to be refusing to disarm. There's more talk of Israel returning to fighting in Gaza. How do you think the Israeli public will respond to it?
I'd be surprised if Hamas right now was not capable of getting some rockets off against Israel and is choosing not to do that. I don't know, what would a Hamas rocket attack on southern Israel do a few days before the election? How would Netanyahu deal with that? Would he say, you got to keep me in here because I'm the only person who can tackle Hamas? And if he said that, how credible would that be? There was a survey yesterday. I think only 25% of people from sort of Gaza border communities feel confident about their security. But broadly speaking, they're quite optimistic and they're trying to rebuild. So there you have the mix there. There are people who've moved to towns and villages near Gaza. People are rebuilding. Kibbutz Be'eri is rebuilding neighborhoods, and it's not the only one. We had elections in the past in Israel where dramatic events very close to the election can remake an election. I think there's every possibility that Gaza could certainly be. Israelis are very conscious that Hamas has not disappeared. Hamas basically has reasserted a reign of terror over most of the Palestinians in Gaza. You're a bit more optimistic in Lebanon because there's a government that at least is trying, maybe, to the limits of its ability without trying to avoid being killed in the process, to marginalize Hezbollah. The situation is incredibly fluid, and therefore I think anything could potentially have a significant impact.
And Gili, how do you see it? If there is a return to fighting, how is that going to impact Israeli attitudes?
I'm not sure that the IDF has enough soldiers to have active fighting in Lebanon and in Gaza and in Iran. Syria, there are soldiers in Syria nowadays, and the West Bank. They're all active places of fighting. I know for a fact that Israel officials are really dealing with this option of getting back to fighting in Gaza in order to disarm Hamas, because no one will do it besides the IDF. Getting back to fighting means in Gaza means, unfortunately, getting more and more soldiers killed in the battlefield. I think that although it's not a political factor, it is. And we're 6 months from the elections. And I think that having fallen soldiers on a daily basis is something that the Israeli society can bear, but not for 3 years. And having the elections 20 days after October 7th, 2026, will mark the fact that the promises of Netanyahu and his government failed. So if there will be continuously fighting in Gaza, I think it will be in the near future, because it must end 2 months before the elections. It cannot be ongoing into the campaign.
We talk about Gaza, so the question is the West Bank. The minority of settlers who engage in arson and vigilantism gets enormous play in the United States. I don't know if the Israeli public is aware of that. It has shocked a lot of people here who don't see Israelis like that. I'm just curious, does this issue at all feature in the campaign, or again is lost because there's just too much going on and it's just part of a laundry list of issues? How do you see it, David?
Okay, so the first thing is it's shocking and horrific. And to my mind, among the many horrific aspects are the fact that the quote-unquote mainstream settler leadership is not strenuously condemning it and dissociating itself from it, and that the degree to which the army is failing to tackle it effectively, and in some cases indulging, and in some cases even participating to some extent. It's terrible. In terms of how it plays out in the election campaign, to be brutally cynical about Israeli politics, the challenge of the anti-Netanyahu camp is to bring people over from quote-unquote right-wing parties to the center, right? And therefore, the more that the parties closer to the center in the anti-Netanyahu camp would highlight that, the more they risk potentially alienating voters who they're trying to win over.
Gili, let me just ask you with the issue of the Trump factor. It seems like you cover the prime minister day in, day out. And there's a whole debate even here in Washington. If Trump would come and campaign for Netanyahu, which at some point would seem shocking, but Vice President Vance went to Hungary to campaign for Erdogan. Didn't help him. We know how it turned out. Didn't help him. But how much do you think, that there is a Trump bump for him in this election?
He truly believes. And I will also remind that we had elections which having billboards with him, shaking hands with Putin and with Trump. This is what Netanyahu sells to his public, that he's the only one who can raise the phone and spoke with Trump for hours. And he is the only one who can say no to the US president, although he hasn't. But this is his sell points, that he is so many years in charge, so many years in the prime minister office. This is the autocorrect in Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. C'est la vie. This is reality for him. And I think that this is exactly the point that Bennett and Eisenkot should be aware of. They are trying to change most of the Israeli voters' immediate back of their mind reaction. Who is the prime minister? Bibi. This is one of their biggest problems, to change the atmosphere that it is a possibility. And who knows this more than Bennett? It can be someone else. It can.
All right. So, David, my final question is, are there things before the election that Netanyahu could, especially in the foreign policy and security realm, that he could do between now and election day that maybe we're not thinking of?
We talked a lot in this podcast about the lack of definitive victory on at least three key fronts, right? Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. Things could change on any of those three fronts. And from minute to minute, we don't know what the United States is really planning where Iran is concerned. It seems pretty clear to us from here that Trump does not want to return to intensive fighting against Iran and doesn't want Israel returning or deepening fighting with Hezbollah in Lebanon or in Gaza. But on all of those fronts, something could change that remakes sufficiently bolsters Netanyahu's standing. Maybe the right place to end is with the last thing that Gili was saying. Netanyahu has been prime minister. He was prime minister for 3 years in the 90s. He's been prime minister, 15 of the past 17 years. Yeah. Half a generation has grown up with those words being synonymous, right? Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that's all people have known. And therefore, for all the struggles, that's the core challenge here. A disunited opposition, an unhappy public, but a prime minister who's been in power for so much of so long, right? You're actually having to make an act of will to say maybe somebody else can be prime minister and might even do a better job. But you're defying the reality in which you've lived for all but 18 months since 2009.
All right, so Gili, final question just is between now and election day, what rabbit can Netanyahu pull out of his hat?
Having the enriched uranium out of Iran, for sure changing the regime, but I'm not sure it's realistic. And I'm also thinking that we also take into consideration his judicial court issues and the fact that he's dealing a criminal court nowadays on a daily basis, or supposed to be on a daily basis. This also might change the map towards the upcoming elections, which are nearby. 6 months in Israel is tons of time, but not at all at the same time.
I want to thank you both, Gili Cohen, David Horovitz, for a fascinating conversation. Thank you both very much for joining us on this episode of Decision Points.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure, David. Take care.
Thank you again for tuning in to this episode of Decision Points. A big thank you to my guests, Gili Cohen and David Horovitz, for joining me today. Please be sure to rate and review us wherever you hear your podcast. It helps us to build our community. And also subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. There's a lot to unpack. Until next time, I'm David Markovsky.